So no, like if we don't have the roots, it's what Simone Weil. No, so for me, Simone Weil becomes this critical between of the Plato and the thousand Veils, the Plato and the Deleuze and different things. And Weil is basically fascinating to me because she is kind of, she has her own line of flight, but she's constantly in relationship with institutions. Right, so she is this uncapturable I associated with the neurodiversity, Lorenzo's work, escaping game theory dynamics, all that stuff, and belonging again to one. And she is absolutely a sort of subjectivity that is able to avoid this logic of capital, this linear logic that leads to all of these problematic dynamics, right? But she has this relationship with the church. She's the mystical, but she's like, the mystical is dangerous, so I need to go to the church to make sure these mystical visions are not leading me astray. But then if the church doesn't have the mystical, it dies, and I need to be on the outside for the sake of the inside, and the inside needs the outside. She's thinking all of these issues, and she's a fascinating thinker. Because she's a Platon. She loves Plato, but she has a Deleuzian bit about her. So she's Platonic Deleuzian. And that's where what you see in Simone Weil is the kind of subjectivity that has this rooted rhizome. And she basically says this. She's like, if we don't have, and this is where she came to believe as a Marxist, the Marxist project was in trouble because it was destroying the way Marxism was looking then. It was destroying roots for the sake of a liberation. It's like, well, that liberation is going to carry you away, right?
Yeah, I think that is a problem of Marxism.
Yeah, and so she's identifying that because you're going to be, because what ends up happening is we've talked about the subconscious that if you remove givens, if you remove, the barbaricism of refinement, if you remove all that, you release the subconscious, the madness, and you're destroyed. That's basically what she's saying.
I suspect also that one of the problems with Marxism is that, like, Marx was so heavily conceptually indebted to his mediation with Hegel that a lot of Marxists have not read Hegel.
Correct.
And then they read Marx. And then they think they don't need to read Hegel, but
Correct.
then that's probably what's at stake and so important in Zizek's move from Marx to Hegel. It's not so much even again this problem with Marx, but it's a problem with the Marxist tradition not tarrying enough with Hegel. So if we want to save the Marxist tradition, then the problem is that we need to go back to tarrying with Hegel, which is one of the reasons why Philosophy Portal is going to be going into the early Marx work. We're going to go slowly into it, but we've got that Hegelian foundation, which I think will give us a chance to look at Marx with a different lens.
100%. Because, for me, the moment you start talking about, the problem is the logic of Marx, in my opinion, the quote-unquote material dialectic, some of the way that he frames it with the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, etc. There's a certain alienation that drives. The interesting thing is that the way Marx talks about alienation does not strike me all the time as the same as contradiction. And there's a difference, actually. Because alienation is going to drive a certain overcoming. It's going to drive a antagonism against a given people, right? So the alienation is not a contradiction you have to tarry with. It's an overcomable contradiction, right, in the universal class, right? Yeah. So alienation, there's an idea where Marx is taking, alienation, in this kind of contradiction, this tension.
Alienation from our labor and capital.
Yeah, that's correct. And he's taking that from Hegel, this kind of logic, and using it to drive the historic sort of process. But actually, the driving is an overcoming of the antagonism. And also, the problem is, in a way, Marx does not, in my opinion, Marx does not locate the antagonism in the subject. This is what's interesting. So we're talking about this idea of the bubble wrap and this idea of the metaxis, the between space, right? We're saying the tension is in the between. We're saying that the tension is in the subject. There's a certain incompleteness that then they need to be in the between. That's almost kind of like a doubling, right?
If you can handle the sort of the inner tension, so to speak, or the inner self-division, so to speak,
yes,
then you might be able to handle the division on the level of the family, and then you might be able to handle the division on the level of the community.
That's correct.
And that's the in-between space.
That's correct. And you see, the suggestion is that there's a social relation between the owners of the means of production and the people that own it that is off because of a certain, there's a certain injustice to the social relation, which is kind of suggesting a possibility of a complete social relation. And also, the antagonism is located in that incomplete, that problematic social relation as opposed into the subject themselves, right? And so there's an idea that once this is overcome through an inevitable kind of a revolution that the alienation causes, then there will be also no need for the state, and then actually what will occur is that antagonism will be corrected, right? That doesn't mean there won't be political decisions, but the antagonism has a certain sort of eschatology to it, right? Well, this is where, in my opinion, Cortani is good, because it's like, no, the capital nation state is all together and you can't get rid of any of it, and it's always going to be there, right? And you have to tarry with it, right? And it's always kind of navigating the three into its own services, and that's also what's lurking in the very way that consciousness works to structure subjectivity.
Now, I think we don't know the future, obviously, like the future with a capital F or something like that. You know, staying with that idea that the past and the future and the now.
Yes.
But like one of the key sort of mental shifts in my life was twofold. It was whether or, now this is not anything to do with the actual ontology of the future, because we don't know.
Correct.
Right? But the assumption I'm making practically to work with the now that's given to me is that I'm assuming that capitalism is going to be here when I die.
Yeah. Right.
Meaning that there's not, like, what I'm trying to defend myself against in that is this idea, which I kind of was consciously or unconsciously laboring under, which is that the revolution was just around the corner.
Right.
Or that there was some great socialist project that was going to enable me, that was going to allow me to escape, say, like some of the things that I've ended up doing, like, say, for example, building a business.
Right.
Right? If I was laboring under the delusion that there was some state-level political project that was going to manifest in the next 5 years, that was going to alleviate any of the self-responsibility for me to build a business, I never would have done it.
Right.
So I was operating on the assumption that capitalism is going to be here when I'm 80.
Yes.
Just have that assumption.
Right.
And then,
no, right.
So, yeah, just back to that, like this sort of, let's say, pragmatic metaphysics that I'm just taking on is like, when I'm 80, capitalism is going to be here.
Yeah.
Now, whether that's true or not is kind of irrelevant.
Right.
But I'm going to work with that assumption that it's here, because that's the reality that's given to me now. And then, you know, not saying that it's not possible to overcome it, but that I'm shooting myself in the foot if I assume otherwise. Right. And then the other thing that I tried to get rid of is this idea that there's going to be an imminent dissolution of all religion.
Yeah.
Like religion's going to go away somehow.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm trying to get away. So, and what's implicit there is this fantasy that in the communist utopia we won't need religion.
Yeah.
Right. That anything that's still around of religion is a symptom of capitalism.
Yes.
Right. So I'm going to assume capitalism is going to be here when I'm 80. Religion's going to be here when I'm 80.
Yes.
So then, given that assumption, how should I act? How should I work with the social reality that's here?
Right.
Right. So I'm again thinking this very, very practically to get out of any idea that basically I'm trying to identify the source of the fantasies where I feel like emancipatory politics can become self-destructive, and it can undermine itself, and it can alienate itself from actually working with the real of historical subjectivity, right? Because one of the biggest contradictions of Marxist subjectivity in terms of the academic performance is that the working class doesn't like you, and the working class is more inclined to be religious. Right? So if you're not able to interface or interact with work, like let's take, for example, the TLC, right? Like I'm listening to some live streams or some group chats in the TLC. A lot of those guys are conservative leaning. A lot of those guys, all of those guys are explicitly religious, trying to get a deeper connection to religion, not trying to get a weaker connection to religion. Right. So if I'm in any way interested in, again, my secret evil plan, like if in my secret evil plan, I'm trying to, again, go from the sexual difference working with the long-term relationship to the foundation of a family that can cultivate friendships towards a community, which can then do the community of communities, which can then do the civil society stuff, which will then be able to interface with the state instead of trying to start with the state, which most Marxist theorists are doing without taking care of all that level, because that's difficult work. Right? Like that's real work. Well, then necessarily, I'm going to be able to need to interface with quote-unquote conservatives, which I like that Zizek's taken the turn of, I'm a moderately conservative communist.
Right.
I think that's a really interesting political position.
Yeah.
That's a helpful political position. And he's always juxtaposing that with, let's say, the position of social democrat.
Right.
Or something like that. And so anyway, like if I'm not capable of actually interfacing with conservatives, but not only that, if I'm not able to accept or look into myself and say, where am I conservative? then again, I'm shooting myself in the foot.
Exactly.
Because if I'm going to say that if I'm just going to say I'm a progressive and I'm not conservative, then I might be missing crucial resources in conservatism that I need to live.
Exactly.
Right? So I think by definition, there must be resources in conservatism that are necessary for me to live. And there must be resources in progressivism that are necessary for me to live.
Yes.
Right? So I accept that. And there must be things and if I'm accepting that capitalism is much better than feudalism, there's certain aspects of capitalism that I need to take on.
Yes.
And I can say, like, as sort of like a retroactive self-report, that if I'm going back to like making these decisions in 2017, 2018, like when I was getting prepared to leave my doctorate, and I was getting prepared to lose my doctoral funding basically. So I know I need to accept the economic. I know I need to be able to confront the economic, right? And I'm surrounded by academics who aren't willing to think about that. Right? That I can actually sort of now say, 8 years later, that the level of self-progress that I've made is enormous. Right? In accepting those basic presuppositions. That I've benefited from that. Now, in, again, this idea of progress that I've been trying to work towards, that tremendous self-progress is, again, not towards a utopia. It's towards problems that, not that, as I explicitly say, like, a week ago, 2 weeks ago, I was dealing with, like, kind of mental breakdown. I'm not saying mental breakdown in the sense that I'm just going to destroy everything, but a mental breakdown in the sense of, like, of course I wrestle with I don't know what to do next. Of course I wrestle with I don't know what the next great move is. Or of course I have the situation where there's, what option do I take? And all these new things that I'm taking on. It's like, because if you're in a long-term relationship, there's dimensions of your relationship where it's not just all smooth sailing, or you encounter things where both of you don't know what to do. Right? So, but that still doesn't mean that it's not social progress. It just means that the new progress has led you to contradictions that you haven't been able to think before. And if you're really willing to think that, then that's a philosophical opportunity. It's not a philosophical obstacle. It's a philosophical opportunity.
For me, again, with that weird Zeno idea that everything is one or be separated by nothing, again, another kind of manifestation of that was a sort of idea of, okay, well, there has to be some way that liberalism and conservatism go together. There has to be resources in these two things. And so, what's interesting is if you take Hegel seriously on the state of now, then nothing exists by mistake. So there has to be some right in it. There has to be there has to be something in it. And you see, the key then is, for me, it's always the creating of, it's always the making sure there's a contradiction that's being formed. If I have to think conservatism and liberalism together, that contradiction forces thinking.
And then I would say also the same thing for fascism and communism. So, like, for me, like, I've also been, like, it's not so much in the book, because I think that's something that's before me still. But, like, if I'm quote unquote a communist, and I get triggered by fascism, then there's something wrong with me in a way. Not saying that I should support, like, an explicit, obviously fascist political party, and there is lines to be drawn, and there is a place where you could be against things, and, like, there are, like, Zizek says, there are real enemies and so forth. But if on the level of rabble discourse, I'm not willing to work with things that have a fascist dimension to them, then I'm not really willing to work with the quote-unquote proletariat, or the quote-unquote, because I'm telling you, if you're going to work with the quote-unquote proletariat, you are going to encounter fascist ideas. You are just going to. It's just a fact. It is a fact of the proletariat. Right? And then the history of communism, that's, like, well known, that, like, a lot of communists will say explicitly that fascism has failed Marxism, or fascism has failed communism. That when communism fails, you're going to have a fascist response that's trying to basically deal with communism on a lower level. And a lot of what fascism is communism on a lower level, because it's on the level of race. Or it's on the level of ethnic identity. Or it's on the level of some sort of patriarchal fantasy. Or, all of those things. But it's not, it's a form of communism that's not able to think the true secular global plurality. But it's still something that's a facticity of the proletariat.
100%. And for me, and that's kind of Koratani suggests that, is that what will happen is, as the capital nation state, if there's a take on capital, then the nation will come to its defense in the form of fascism. If the state begins to decline, the same will occur. But what's very interesting is fascism, since it allows a free market, the free market can come back in fascism, and then the state picks a winner. Well, then that sets up for the communist response against that free market. But then as communism fails, then there's a response of fascism, and it keeps in fascism has an opening for the free market. It sets up the conditions for the possibility of the communist revolution against the fascists. But it's actually all maintaining the capital nation state for Courtine. It's all maintaining that triplex.
Right.
And so there's no actual progress. And the capital nation state just continues on. Now, Courtine is not saying that the capital nation state is some devious plan that some people came up with. It is, you could say, emerged from the failure to think the contradiction of theopolitical. And that is what has emerged as the challenge that will not go away. Like Courtine's like, it will not go away. You could say the way is shut, per se, of Studebaker. And so if it's not going to go away, there has to be sublated. But it can only be sublated if you think the frickin' theopolitical. And we haven't thought that. It's frickin' hard. And so, that one of the reasons I do appreciate Courtine, despite the way, like you said with Kant, there's this notion of the kind of perpetual peace. There's the idea in Courtine, it's like because you'll kill yourself if you don't. Like the capital nation state is kind of like you're going to nuke yourself if you don't. And I think that's basically what we think. We're like, well, all of this will have to work out, or otherwise we all die. Right? But that's lazy thinking.
I think so.
Yes.
Yeah, I've always, even with the nuke thing, and the nukes are going to wipe us all out. I mean, I've never been too convinced by it, because if you think about, even if you dropped a nuke, for me, I think if you dropped a nuke on every major city in the world, I still think humans would survive.
Sure.
We would be seriously depleted. We would be seriously, we would be in serious trouble. We would be under a civilizational collapse.
Yes.
But it's hard for me to imagine. It would be hard to convince me of something that would completely wipe us out.
I agree.
I think what's much more difficult to think is how the human being necessarily is in this process of transcending itself and overcoming itself. And it's much more the thought experiment that I always run, and it is actually in the last chapter. So in the Revenge of Philosophy chapter, I give the thought experiment that's motivated a lot of my work, which is the thought experiment of, if you think about any organism on the planet, you can easily think about what that form would look like 5 million or 10 million years in the future.
I love this.
But if you run the thought experiment of what would the United States look like in 5 million years, it's like if you put that into a computer, it would give you back the reading of does not compute. Right? Because there's something about because when we think about long-term civilization, when we think about ancient Egypt or we think about China, we're thinking about things that last at most 5,000 years. Yeah. So thinking about a civilizational entity that exists for 5 million years is just unthinkable. Yes. It's something that, now that's when we're really challenged with the idea of emergence.
Yes.
Or the thought experiment that I always run is so now this is totally a speculative thought experiment. But if you imagine, for example, being some sort of disembodied observer in the early universe, and you just saw this distributed plasma, right? You just have these gradients of plasma, right?
Right.
And nothing, there would be no planets yet, there would be no stars yet, all you just see is the early universe in its early form, right? But then you just jump to that, say, for example, the form of a giraffe or the form of, you'd be like, how did that happen, right? That would be you get this huge discontinuity, right. This huge gap. And I think that what we're dealing with the human phenomena on that cosmic timescale is kind of thinking, if we think about what the United States or what the global international order or what the theopolitical problem is birthing. Mm-hmm. We're thinking about something of that level of qualitative difference. It could be that we're thinking about that, and I think that's deeper. I think that's more importantly, I think that's a more interesting way to frame the philosophical problem of the human being than it is to say we're all just going to die. Right? Or we're all just going to be in an apocalypse.
Yeah.
Right? I think that's it doesn't make sense to me, because again, I could think of things that are genuine existential threats. For example, if there was a black hole, that was wandering through our neighbor of the solar system.
Yes.
Well, then we're done. We're literally done. That would take us out. Right? An asteroid impact of the size that happened 65 million years ago, it's hard to see how we come out of that.
Right, sure.
It's hard. Maybe there would be some small pockets that would come out of it, because it would take a few years for the dust to settle and for things to be reconstituted.
Right.
We would be, at best, in completely fragmented hunter-gatherer tribes again.
Yeah. That's right.
But so there are things that are genuine existential threats. But, again, I think it's much more difficult to think the problem of the evolutionary imminence of what the human being is.
Completely.
I think that's and somehow, I guess that would be a presupposition or an axiom, is that somehow that's related to the theopolitical.
I think so. I think
the theopolitical is gestating something, and how it's appeared in the future now of previous nows.
Yes.
So how it's appeared in the future now of previous nows is the kingdom of God, or world communism. That's the same eschatological structure. Or, let's say, the post-human in its positive form, right? Like Kurzweil will think the post-human in its positive form, meaning that he thinks that the post-human and the human is on some sort of positive continuity.
Yes.
Meaning that we'll merge with the technology, but we'll see it as such a great opportunity for spirit that there'll be spiritual machines.
Yes.
And these spiritual machines will be able to do things and experience things that will be so great that it'll be way better than the human experience, that it's overall, in some sense, a self-annihilation, but it's an ecstatic self-annihilation into something fantastical. Right? And somehow, and in Systems and Subjects, there's a part of Systems and Subjects where I try to think the legitimacy of all those future nows.
Yes.
Like somehow the kingdom of God and world communism and post-humanism and all those things, somehow they're all intimating something true, even if they're all partial in their intimations. And ultimately we don't know. Right? But what all of them are pointing towards, to me, is some really radical qualitative difference, which by definition, because in the same, and so they give this example of, in the same way that the it's not, so there are humans that don't understand quantum mechanics. Right? But every human can, in principle, understand quantum mechanics. That the possibility of understanding quantum mechanics is a part of our nature.
Yes.
Whereas the chimpanzee, it's not a part of their nature. It's not possible for them to understand quantum mechanics. Right? So, I think that's another sort of way I think about the philosophy of transhumanism, or think about transhumanism philosophically, is that there's something that's happening that we're fundamentally the Kantian, it's a Kantian problem.
Right.
Which there's something fundamentally limited about our cognition that we, by principle, can't understand it because we're human.
Right. No, I think that's exactly.
So that's the last chapter. The last chapter, that's the revenge of philosophy for me.
Oh, I love that. I love it so much. And that, you see, whereas someone almost like where a Chomsky kind of makes the example of, a pig could never look at the stars and understand it. And there's that kind of dismissal of philosophy, therefore. There are just some things we can never know and we're down. That's the beginning of thought. How do we
Yeah, exactly.
It's not the end, it's the tarrying way.
And that's the beginning of Kant and all that stuff.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So it really comes back to practical things. And that's also coming back to how you were doing the philosophy in the common life, and then I was doing the philosophy in the transhumanism.
Yes.
And that's kind of where I've gotten to with, kind of trying to enrich transhumanism with the philosophical cognition, that because most of the people in the transhumanist discourse are coming from the technical fields.
Right.
So they're in the technical truth field.
Right.
And again, they're not thinking about those imminent philosophical problems, and that the stakes are there quite big. And interestingly enough, later in this year, I'm going to be going to a transhumanist conference hosted by Ben Goertzel.
Oh.
And so I'm interested in what's going to happen at that event, and I piece together what I'm going to try and talk to there. But Ben Goertzel thinks that the frontier of what artificial general intelligence experts need to think about is complexity science and cognitive science. And I guess what I'm going to try and do is introduce the phenomenology and the psychoanalysis angle of things, that's going to become really important for the artificial general intelligence to think through as well.
Right.
But I'm really interested in how that works, because ultimately, it's kind of going to represent some kind of full circle sublative moment with my origin in the Global Brain Singularity Institute,
Right.
Towards basically taking on the challenge and like taking the risk that this field needs philosophy.
Yes, yes. Well, so there's a few things. Philosophy is birthed in relation to a certain question of limitation. And do we think the limit or do we stop at the limit? If there is nothing that is... There's a weird way in which philosophy has been kind of kicked out because there's a claim of unknowability. These things are unknowable. Therefore, we're done, right?
They're just speculation.
They're just speculation. They're just speculations. But really the key is that they're unknown, right? And that means it's like the mountains. The mountains are unknown. Oh, well, that means there's an exploration to be had. But there's always something unknown. So in a sense, a world where there isn't an unknown is unknowable, right? And that's true. But that's very different from saying that there are unknowables that we don't have to worry about because they're unknowable, right? There are things of which may be practically unknowable because of the historic moment, but that's not to say that they are technically unknowable. But the reality is the practical unknowability of, say, the future that has to be tarried with, that we can know as an unknown in our now and our experience too, right? And that's what you have to tarry with, and philosophy then emerges as the kind of mediation of that entire knot and our subjective relation to those things. To me, there was this idea earlier that you were saying on the training of desire, in this problem of training of desire.
Yeah.
What's very interesting is, like I've spoken with Jochen about, for Aristotle, virtue is a training of desire. It is not just like right and wrong or whatever, and it's all tied to things like habits, temperance, surprise, encounter. So much of Aristotle's ethics is about actually what you do in the unknown. The ethical is not really needed except in the unknown, because he makes distinctions between like law, you could say morality, ethics, law, and ethics, and so much of like Aristotle's ethics, which of course are tied to a question of a certain singularity and lack, is going to be how we actually develop a way of being that is able to be prepared for the unexpected, right?
Yeah.
And so the ethical emerges precisely from a proper sort of reaction to not an unknowability, but the unknown, right? And what you can say is all of that then, the ethical for Aristotle is the question of social relations. Like how you're going to do social relations and not have them kind of fall apart in different things, right? And if you don't have the ethics, you can't...
Theopolitical.
That's correct. So it's the ethics of the theopolitical, but what's so interesting is Aristotle's talking about habits. He's talking about like basically stuff of patience of the concept. He's talking about all these things that most people have taken quote-unquote value ethics and laughed them off. Most people have said value ethics, oh, that's ridiculous. We just need utilitarianism. We just need pragmatism. Well, what Aristotle is doing makes a whole lot of sense if we think of value ethics as basically theopolitical ethics. It's the ethics of theopolitics. And then, of course, Aristotle is suggesting that the ethics as such cannot be done without philosophy, because philosophy is actually the thinking that is necessary for the coming into a way of being that can actually be able to rightly find fittedness live in surprise situations that without doing you can't have the theopolitical. And that's very important. You can't train desire. And then, of course, as you habituate yourself to said virtue, your desires change and you come to actually be driven by the desire moves to a drive for the maintaining of the theopolitical. It moves toward the drive to maintain the ethical, right? And so, but then all of that possibility emerges from the sort of permanence of the partial object, because you can never make a final system. Wherever the ethical is located is where you're going to encounter with the singularity. That is going to mean that you're always dealing, and then what ends up happening, the reason why virtue trains desire is because if it is in regard to a partial object and the partial object trains desire, then your desire is toward that partial object of the singularity. And so the ethical becomes a certain sort of training of the desire and the partial object, but this is where it's so interesting. What does, of course, Aristotle talk about with the political, the polis? It has to be limited. It can only be so small. So everything here's the problem again with the limits of Aristotle, for me, is that everything Aristotle is saying, spot on, man, but it's the same problem as Hume. What do you do if the polis is now global? How do you have a global polis, right? Because the ethics of what you would do is different.
Which is, I think, again, this point which I make it in the relationship between Hegel and Plato.
Right.
Just because it's
Keep talking.
more...
A little light in your
Well,
eyes.
the relationship between Hegel and Plato is just but I think it applies in the context you're talking about Aristotle, is that again, it's not that Hegel's smarter than Plato. It's just that he's existing at a different time. The same self-limitation applies to Hegel.
Yes.
Which is that Hegel's not existing in our time.
Correct.
And there are things that are appearing in our time, which is, again, philosophy is what? Philosophy is our time comprehended in thought. And so what that means is, of course, if you're coming into philosophy and you're interested in all these great thinkers,
yes,
read the greats, read Plato, read Aristotle, read Descartes, read Hume, read
yes,
Hegel, and all these thinkers. But at the end of the day, none of these thinkers, from Plato to Hegel to Heidegger to whoever, none of these thinkers is they're training grounds.
Yes.
They're training grounds for us to think our moment, and that's ultimately our challenge.